Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on who owns application security in the age of DevOps. I'm Christina Cardoza, news editor of SD Times. Before we get started, I have a couple of quick housekeeping announcements. First, if you have any questions at any time during the presentation, you may submit them using the Control Panel's Questions tab. We will be doing a live Q&A after the presentation. Secondly, this webinar will be recorded and available on demand through the sdtimes.com website in about 24 hours after the event. Here at SD Times, we know security can no longer be an afterthought, but the speed in which code is being built, updated, and delivered is making it difficult for security teams to keep up. Today's webinar will look at how to develop at the speed of business while also maintaining application security and the roles developers have to play. Presenting today, we have Jeffrey Martin and Reese Arkins, directors of product at WhiteSource. So now to get things started, I'm going to throw it over to you, Jeff.
All right. First, hello, everybody. Reese, if you want to say hello, chime in.
Hey, Jeff. Hi, everyone.
So we're going to cover, obviously, who owns application security in the age of DevOps. But let's kind of just start it off, dive in. So we're going to break this out into a few pieces. First, we're going to talk about how AppSec is becoming more complex. Nothing new, no giant new story here, right? We know application security is becoming an increasing focus. But the problems you have change as the development frequency increases. We'll talk for a minute about how the responsibility for AppSec is moving towards different teams than has been traditional. And we'll ask at the end whether or not developers actually have the tools needed for their job. All right, so that was my table of contents. Let's get into the actual first bit. AppSec is becoming more complex as the release frequency increases. So, big picture here. Let's talk about a little bit of data. So this is from Forrester, State of Application Security in 2019 and beyond. And they found that the top two external attack vectors of for software vulnerabilities against web applications were web application attacks, SQL injection, cross-site, etc., and pure software vulnerabilities. Reese, I have some thoughts on this, but did you have any surprises in this particular bit of data?
Not really. I wouldn't call this a surprise. I think that for those who work in the industry, the fact that some of your more like movie style attacks, the ransomware and phishing, lost stolen credentials, I'm not surprised at all that in reality, those are quite low down in this. What you'll notice in the top two, we have highlighted them, is that the type of exploits that are quite easy to carry out, but also particularly that you can carry them out remotely, you can carry them out almost with impunity in that, unless you do something really major, you're unlikely to get caught for it. These, no surprise at all that we see these being the top two. And, you look at software vulnerability, for example, where we kind of specialize. I mean, there's two sides to this, right? As we get better at identifying software vulnerabilities, it also means that people have no choice but to keep up because, we're all, the bad guys can also identify them, right? So we don't really have a choice or not there. And then web application attacks, these are pretty kind of traditional ones where people can probe APIs, they can try SQL injection and so on. So basically, these are the ones where people can like continuously probe and try until they find success. And yeah, definitely no surprise. When I look at, say, even number three, use of stolen credentials, I actually wonder how much those have actually been exploited or people are just remembering cases where it happened, because I've been in plenty of companies where like someone's lost a laptop or there has been some credential and everyone's had to like rotate keys or there's been a change in security. That doesn't mean that anybody actually was even close to exploiting it. So I would not be surprised if even number three is lower in reality. So yeah, I think that this matches with
some other.
Yeah,
to me, I love that the laziest ones are kind of the top, right? The ones that are just very, very little effort compared to social engineering, which certainly takes a heck of a lot of effort.
Yeah, you don't have to talk to anybody, and you can keep doing it. You can do it at any time of night. It's no surprise that these are the highest attack vectors for most companies.
Yeah, and I like your point that actually it's relatively anonymous. It's pretty hard to get caught, and even if you are caught, it's extremely hard to prove it was you.
Yeah, yeah. I
So
mean, probing websites for vulnerabilities or SQL injections, this is like it's like complaining on Twitter. I mean, you can get away with it as long as you don't do something really bad.
I love that. It's like complaining on Twitter. Whole new webinar, right? Just
Yeah,
why
yeah. I mean,
software vulnerabilities are like Twitter
if you go
users.
too far, that you're gonna have a problem. But otherwise, you can basically get away with it.
All right, makes sense. All right, maybe with that we'll move on to the
All
next
right.
one.
So, we've identified what kind of like what the problems are. I think Jeff on the next slide. There we go. So now we
Yeah.
kind of look at, okay, those are the problems. What are people doing about it? Well, the good news is that 58% do see security as a top priority, or at least that's what they say in a survey that asks them. And so this means that companies have processes in place to detect and remediate vulnerabilities. Yeah, so like it is a good sign. At least we're above 50% in terms of people taking it seriously.
Yeah, I seriously wonder about that 25% in bright yellow there that says, I only think about security when an issue arises. I feel like they might be lagging behind the times. That's very, very
Yeah,
reactive.
I'm impressed that
Um,
25% of people will admit to only considering security when an issue arises. So I am
yeah,
only reactive about security. That's I think we'll see that one go down over time.
good argument for why we made this survey, which is this is now our data, anonymous, right? They're a little
Yeah,
more honest. I don't think
yeah,
anybody out loud would be like, I'm the CISO, but I only care about security when the issue
yeah.
arises.
Well, on the
Um,
internet these days, no one trusts things to be anonymous, so they're probably, yeah,
that's true. Especially you would hope security people.
that's true.
Um, but the 14% who just say, I don't think about security at all, I do wonder, security concerns do differ by industry. I
Yeah.
wonder if I can't imagine any serious software that doesn't have some level of personally identifiable information or something you need to keep clear, very secure. But uh, maybe that is just an industry thing. I think maybe next time we do that survey, we'll divvy it out a little bit by industry.
Yeah,
Um,
I think the next time we definitely do want to do that because there's definitely been there's a different trend compared to the industry. I was chatting with someone last week, a VP engineering, and his company, kind of like us, they're a security company. They
mhm.
make endpoint security for the US government, and so he was saying that security is just an absolute non-negotiable, just a non-negotiable. That if they were exploited doing what they're meant to do best, it would just basically be like end of times for their company. So I mean, that's at one extreme. I can understand that, other people that make, like iPhone games or something like that will probably think, well, if there was a problem, I'll create a new account, make a new game. I mean, I can see that for some cases.
Yeah, I mean, I will just state kind of out loud, and I assume this audience knows this, but those people are wrong. Um, at the end of the day, one, reputation matters, but two, even an iPhone game has so much things to keep secure. Since you can purchase through your iPhone and there's personally identifiable information and all sorts of fun regulations like GDPR, that can have real business consequences, even for things you don't think necessarily should be all that serious, like a game.
Yeah, yeah. Well, look, and I actually wonder though, that 14%, that's almost, you know, we're a security company asking these questions. I even wonder if, in a way, that's a little bit of a protest vote, like because it is true that, security as part of the software development like workflow has been relatively new for many people. So I can understand some people having a bit of a resistance to it and deciding, yeah, I'm gonna answer the security company's survey and say I don't think about security because it slows me down. I would not be surprised if it's a
Leave me
protest
alone.
vote.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So one other big piece of data here that I just wanted to call out, which was, all right. So look, I'm not actually a developer. I'm a director of product like you, Reese. But I think we come from slightly different backgrounds. I'm more of a business process type of guy. Um, there's I'll say I'm guilty of this and things that do not involve security. Sometimes people like me tend to approach security as a bit of a check mark, especially when it comes to training, right? Like, do we
Yeah.
do a training? It's almost like sexual harassment training, right? Everybody's got to go through it when they join. They watch a video, they answer a couple questions. It's a checkbox. Move on. Um, I, I don't know. To me, I wasn't shocked that a huge amount of the respondents were saying they only trained security at hire, because that's just what I'm used to seeing from the business type people. I am really surprised actually that 36% of the respondents said that their company provides them with security training that actually is helpful. So I'm curious what your take is. What is the real driver for people to approach actually useful training in security?
Yeah, I think again, security as like an intrinsic part of the process, that is still new to many. I think unfortunately the reality is that there are still many companies that are in what is usually called the cover your assets point of view. So the reality is there are actually a lot of like managers in engineering companies, and their view is I need like plausible defensibility. You know, I bought products from some security vendors. Everyone has been trained at least once, and they realize that that doesn't make security, but their actually main concern is, that they've got that plausible deniability. So I think that's partly just a maturity aspect of the industry that, people will realize, today it's like, we've seen exploits where, people will be questioned, and the reality is they had no processes in place. So we're at the point now everyone realizes I need a process in place. I think we'll get to a next level where it will be a matter of, but really, do you think that process actually achieved anything? We haven't quite got past that, and I think that explains a lot of the ones where, yeah, I get some kind of like security kind of like training / survey when I start, and then the company can tick a box.
Yeah, they're just not quite taking it seriously. Now, to me, I kind of wonder if the 36% is a coordinated number, related to just the number of companies that are really releasing frequently. Because I think the more companies release frequently, the more they certainly should prioritize actually useful training. But I think generally, because they're empowering developers to make more of their own decisions as they release more frequently, I think maybe the developers are actually going out and finding better training, not allowing the company to just give them the checkbox type, but actually saying, no, 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 I need something useful. I'm not going to waste my time. I need to learn.
Yeah, like developers are definitely, taking more control of security. We're getting to that, and yeah, I think you're
I'm
right
going
on
to cut you off just because that was like the perfect segue right there.
that. I ruined
Right?
it.
Look, I mean, responsibility over AppSec is shifting to development teams. Was literally
Yeah,
what we were about to
yeah.
say. um, but all right, so I mean, we
Okay,
talked a
so
little
let's
bit
see,
about the
let's see,
problem.
let's see who owns it right now. Survey says.
Right. So, okay, let's see how this solution to everything is changing here. Who owns it? Well, what 72% of the people said that
Yeah,
ownership lies with the software development teams, which
I
I'm happy to hear.
Oh, I'm very happy to hear. I'm surprised by that one. I wonder if there's a little bit of a skew in the sample size or the sample industry, because that's pretty amazing to me. I think the reality is that the worst thing you can do in this scenario is you say that, like, okay, developers, you have responsibility for security now, but you don't truly give them the ownership of it in terms of um, being empowered to make the decisions. So this is very good. I'm actually surprised security teams is down to 28%. I guess that can also reflect though on the number of people answering and the size of the company. So this would be another one where it would be interesting to slice and dice it a little bit to understand how the size of the company influences, because there's a certain size where you simply don't have a security team unless security is, what you do.
Sure, I mean that makes sense. I'm actually curious before we kind of move on that where do you think this was maybe 5 years ago?
Oh, I mean, it would have to be, it's hard to say, but it would be something like 80% would have been owned by security teams, and the other 20% don't have a security team. I think, So, I mean, it would be like asking someone who owns HR, who owns hiring in your organization. People would answer HR own, So nowadays, though, with security is moving, as we call it, shift left into the development lifecycle, and that's reflected in these results.
Huh. Well, it's funny. It's funny you asked about company size and industry. It's almost like you know what the next slide is.
It's like I've seen the
Yeah, isn't
results
it
already.
amazing? So no surprise here, right? The bigger the company, the more they depend on security teams. You just mentioned that. Um,
Yeah.
but I do kind of wonder. I hear a lot about the security champion model right now. Embedding kind of specialists or training one person in a scrum team to focus more on security. I don't know how that's really reflected here, because that's a weird DevOps and developers kind of movement there. I think part of that is the team leaders on software development. But fundamentally, I've seen the security model work, the security champion model rather, work pretty well. Do you have an opinion on dedicated specialists versus, charging somebody on the existing team with learning more versus, a specialized security team?
Yeah. So if you speak to companies that take security really seriously, you will hear them say that there's no way you can eliminate security teams. There is still a need for people that really specialize in it. It's like saying that, when like all developers, are involved in design these days, it doesn't mean you don't have a designer, like a dedicated person for it. And the security champion within teams, it's an interesting compromise because in a way, it's sort of like admitting that you can't just overnight say we're all responsible for security and suddenly everybody, you put together the pieces and we're secure because we're all doing, our little bit. So I think that the security champion is an interesting, like compromise almost, where it's like taking someone with a little bit more of a specialization and betting them earlier in the software process, reviewing like design decisions and things like that, just being right there and being aware that, this is part of your responsibility.
Now, one thing I've seen a few companies at least now do is they take the existing security team, because a lot of them have one, and they use them almost as a training center for those security champions. There's a couple of companies I just talked to, actually, don't want to mention them by name, but fundamentally that's kind of how they re-architected to empower those developers more. I'm from several different industries. I've seen that happen before in software testing, where it used to be a dedicated quality team, and increasingly it becomes more on the developers. I kind of feel like it's the same motion, honestly, where you have specialists in something, but they're training and distributing that knowledge and spreading it throughout the team.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just one of the models I kind of liked. Do you have any real viewpoint on, let's say, DevOps versus developers in this? That was one I couldn't wrap my head around quite right.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting one because I mean traditionally when people do distinguish between developers and DevOps, it indicates that there is some kind of partition or handoff between developers and DevOps. I guess we can partly put this down to this word in the question, who owns it? I mean, because that's not saying they're the only one who does it. It's not saying nobody looks at security until it hits DevOps. It just
Right.
might mean that out of developers and DevOps, like in the end, DevOps make the call on whether the things that developers have done is good enough to go like into production.
Sort of the safety check, if you will.
Yeah, yeah,
Which, I mean, at the end of the day, like I said, there weren't any big surprises here when you slice this up by size.
yeah,
Although I was a little bit surprised there was still that many team leaders in companies that were under 1,000 people. That seems like a lot, but interesting.
yeah, yeah. I think just put it down to the fact that we phrased it like who owns it. Yeah,
Uh,
not who does it all. Yeah,
it's like who owns sales? If you ask the CEO, he's like, everybody's a salesperson. If you ask
right.
sales, they say, I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
All right. So we talked about not only like who is doing it, but also when they do it is the important part here. So we this slide covers like the impact of developers taking over security and the tools that they're integrating into the software development lifecycle. So this is interesting. It shows 66% take action either before in the build stage or before the build stage. I mean, this is a very good sign. Like, the opposite to that is, a story I was told last week different company where, a developer, basically finished a new module, brought it up for review, and found that it had been built on top of a deprecated and insecure dependency. Couldn't be done. Like, it's not appropriate. I mean, that's not necessarily the developer's fault. I mean, if there's not tools in place, if you have a policy that says no, unmaintained dependencies or no vulnerable dependencies get added, and you don't incorporate that into your build or even into your IDE, if you're shifting even further left, that's a process failure. That's not a developer failure.
Yeah, it's fundamental too, because everybody in the entire development cycle depends on other people doing their piece. Originally I came from medical devices, and we would refer to that as the supply chain, right? It very realistically, if you're building on top of, let's say, a standardized image, you have to trust that that image has no vulnerabilities. You don't have time as the developer to deal with your own stuff and the infrastructure.
Yeah.
But I do think
Yeah.
it was interesting that the way this was phrased, because it's, where do you spend most of your time implementing the security measures? Which isn't quite the same as saying, where do you get the most value out of your time? Just I'm actually a
Yeah,
little
I mean, the
curious
fact
here.
if you have 36% before build, that just might mean that people don't have very good tools there and spend a lot of manual time.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that's basically honestly what I was about to ask. Do you think the tools have an issue here? Is it harder to do this post build? I mean, I personally think generally it's a lot easier to do it the earlier you get.
Yeah.
So if you're doing more post-build testing, it takes a lot of time. But yeah, do you think it's a tooling issue or a training issue, or just the people who are doing it as it moves from like developers to DevOps, for instance?
I would put down the fact that we see such high before build is that software developers are very aware of the need for this. They probably don't want to commit something to the build and have it fail in front of everybody. And so I think it's a combination of awareness, probably with lack of tools in the pre-build stage, where whether it is IDE plugins that tell you if a vulnerability you're adding, if a dependency you're adding is vulnerable, or it might be if it's a license violation, similar kind of concept, or even going even further left, and you have like browser-based tools that can warn you if you're browsing old versions of things or things like that, or Stack Overflow answers recommending a 3-year-old version of something.
Yeah, I mean, boy, that's like ultimate shifting left, right? Pre-code, completely pre-code.
Yeah, it's like the Clippy. Hey, it looks like you're about to copy and paste that vulnerable Stack Overflow code.
Honestly, I wish I had Clippy for like everything I did. It'd be great. Just hey, you're about to make a
Yeah.
mistake.
Yeah, hey, you're about to agree to do a webinar you shouldn't.
Wow. All right, last time I asked you. All right. All right. So let's move on to the next one, I think.
Yeah.
Just because I have no idea how to transition out of that. Um, so, all right, we have some data here on the amounts. Basically, how does the open source usage in your organization affect the likelihood that you will actually implement application security
Yeah,
tools?
look, there's a lot of colors here and a lot of words. So, and
I know.
I think we're going a bit slowly. So I'm going to jump in because it took me a while to figure out how this was working. So you see, there's 3 sections: all the time, very often, and sometimes. That's referring to open source usage. So the top level is people who use open source all the time, and there we're seeing, that IDE talked about just before, like 35%, for example. People who use open source only sometimes, you can see that it's much less like shifted left. So the orange IDE is only like 15% there. So no surprise, the more people are using open source, the better the tools that they're integrating earlier or left into the software development lifecycle.
Makes sense to me. I do find the IDE one very specifically interesting because it's such a greater amount for all of the time versus even very often. Um, eh, do you have any insight onto that? Like, I mean, is there a reason why somebody who's basing most of their code on open source apparently, is really integrating into the IDE versus, let's say, the build stage?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's about the earlier you catch things in the build process, sorry, in the development process, the less time you take and the less money it is. So, I think it's great if you know that if you have automated tests that you can run as part of the build, why not run them inside the IDE? We already do things like linting for common code mistakes, so something that flags vulnerabilities or badly structured code. I mean, that's excellent to put in the IDE, save everybody time.
It's interesting too. Another way to phrase that is almost like people who use open source all the time are actually smarter about security, right? Apparently.
Maybe. Yeah, yeah,
All right. So let's kind of move on to the third phase of this,
yeah.
because we kind of led into it a little bit. Do developers have the tools they need for their job? And I think we're going to tie this in a little bit closer to open source because it's the
Yeah,
first phrases on the next slide. Open
yeah,
source
yeah.
security.
Right. So I guess open source, just in general, anybody who say watched GitHub's live stream last week for the universe, their CEO Nat Friedman declared open source has won. It's like, let's just say it, open source has won. It's like, 95% of companies respond that that they use open source as a major component of what they build. I mean that is victory. People trust open source. People are using it, and people have got over the not invented here approach to building software.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that actually leads into why the amount of vulnerabilities is skyrocketing. We don't have the numbers for 2019 yet because, well, it's not over, as much as I keep saying 2020. However, I mean, you can just see this. I don't even need to really talk too much about it. Are there other factors you think that might be driving this growth, though, besides just people are using more open source?
Yeah, look, I just see two main factors here. One is that there is more open source and there are more eyeballs looking for vulnerabilities in it because we really have woken up to the fact that that we do need to be taking care of open source security. I think we've kind of broken one of the misunderstandings of open source that existed, maybe up to even 2018 potentially. People always had this idea that open source must be secure by its nature because it's open and you have like 1,000 eyeballs looking at it. And the reality is, anybody who's ever maintained an open source project, you'd know that like a lot of the code that goes into an open source project has only been looked at by two sets of eyes, right? So the increase of companies like White Source, like us, who specialize in finding and indexing vulnerabilities, you multiply that by the amount of open source, and that explains why you have such a big like hockey stick graph here.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who has actually run an open source repository and program, um, do you think is there more transparency? Are open source maintainers trying purposefully to surface more vulnerabilities and be more open? Or is it just a factor of there's more eyeballs and we're all better educated and learning more about security?
I think it's mostly more eyeballs. I don't think there's been any change to any kind of like approach or even ethics of open source maintainers. I don't think anyone was hiding them until now. Definitely not to explain anything like the growth we've seen. I think there's more open source and there's just more being found.
Makes sense. All right. Bridging the gap. I just
Yeah.
noticed this is
So
our only animated slide. This one's very active.
oh yeah, that's good. So yeah, look, I mean, this one's good. It's really simple, but it makes a good message. This is why, we did say that you can't necessarily replace completely, security specialists. But if you look at the ratio, just this example ratio of, security specialists to DevOps to developers, we can see that there's maybe, a 15-to-1 ratio of eyeballs from developers to security. So the difference in mindset is that you have, say, 15 developers being aware of security and conscious of it when they develop. It doesn't even mean they spend more time. It actually can just mean that they make better decisions. The decisions they make are better, because they're more aware of, checking for bounds and things like that. And that's a lot easier than, saying having no awareness and no care about it, and then just handing it off to a single security person to review thousands of lines of code each release, and try and, kind of pen test or find the error. So this is the reason why we say security is shifting left, because it just makes it a lot more like scalable if we have developers being aware and taking care of it.
Yeah, and honestly too, it seems like the more it scales, the more scalable it is. I know that sounds kind of strange, but fundamentally, the more as an industry, the software industry, we keep pushing the developers to learn a little bit more about security, the more that's spreading out, and the more they're almost demanding that they are somewhat responsible for security.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. This one we threw in because I just find it fascinating. So I don't know if you can tell from the accents, but I'm very American, and Reese is from basically everywhere, but European at the moment, right?
Yeah.
Um, so the differences between Europe and North America, I found it a little bit. I have no idea why. I'm going
Yeah.
to say this. I'm an American.
So
Maybe you're more familiar with Europe, right?
I
Um,
I
why is
decided
there a
this is a
difference?
little I decided this is a little bit like one of those like trick questions that get circulated on Facebook or something, because I added up the percentages. And actually, the because remember, people can pick more than one. And so actually part of what you're seeing here is that for North America, it adds up to like 202%, and for Europe, it adds up to like 188%. So it's not too easy to draw direct conclusions comparing directly like blue and yellow. I think it's interesting to compare the ratios in particular, for, say North Americans take something more, is more important than over something else. I think, for example, that in North America, we've seen some very, very high profile like security problems in companies, especially in social security, in finance. So I think that goes a long way to explaining why there's more North Americans who look about known vulnerabilities. I think that vulnerable, and exploit and data loss, I think that's really top of mind, um, more in North America, where people's own social security numbers have been exposed. Like that gives you a lot more like awareness, right? We haven't seen so much of those problems in Europe. I mean, maybe the data's been stolen, we just don't know it yet, but we haven't been seeing those.
So
I thought it
it's
was interesting, feedback from colleagues and websites. I don't know if that just means, Europeans are less likely to talk to their colleagues about stuff and prefer to research it themselves. So that was quite a distinct difference. But otherwise, I'd call these overall pretty equal within margins of error.
Yeah, the one that jumped out at me was the known vulnerabilities, and just kind of as an American, I will say I do think as a culture we're a little bit more conscious of making sure we're not blamed for obvious things.
Yeah, yeah, that's
And
true.
there
I
was
mean, known
so many
vulnerability.
American, yeah, like that's a no-brainer, and there's a
Sure.
very CYA culture in
Yeah,
most
there's no
American
excuses on that
developers.
part.
Right. Alrighty. So moving along, just so we can keep on time. All right. So this was actually the most shocking data to me. I just gonna be honest. This was the piece that I was like, wow. 34% of the respondents are using automated tools. But why are people still running an SCA tool only once or twice a year, or God forbid, manually? Those two was a shockingly high number to me, given the fact that like some of these tools have been out for a long time. Certainly, we've been around for a while. Um, I cannot picture the box checking kind of attitude for running it once or twice a year, or doing anything manual in any real
Yeah.
way as a developer.
Yeah, look,
Um,
there's no excuse for this 34%. I'll actually also agree. I think that's the most shocking of all the results, that only 34% automated. I have a favorite saying, which is never send a human to do a machine's job. Vulnerability scanning, this is something that can be automated. You should see this figure just keep approaching 100% over the years. There's no excuse. No one will be able to justify ad hoc or manual scanning when it's so obvious of what the impacts are.
and I mean, to me, 24% of people aren't even doing anything really with tools. They're just waiting for the security team to tell them something happened, which, again, it's just so reactive and massively time consuming, as we'll cover in a second.
Yeah, this one will change. Let's move on.
All right, so once they have their problems, how do they fix them?
Yeah,
Um, Go ahead.
So yeah, I mean, this one is, I mean, we reached a stage in the last few years where people got like automated, alerting or notifications that you have vulnerabilities. And the obvious next step was, okay, so why do you expect me to do something about it? Like, you know exactly what the problem is. Why can't you just fix it? Like, this is not the Turing test or something. It's like update version 1.0.0 to version 1.0.1 or something like that. So we're seeing an increase in people. Well, I mean, it's in availability of tools, but now once people realize that, okay, I'm going to get alerts for vulnerabilities, then they say, yeah, but I want you to fix it for me too. Like, give me a one-click fix, and we refer to that as like remediating a problem.
So, I mean, I'm going to just mention here that remediation costs different amounts depending on where you do it. It's one of the main driving factors from a business perspective for shifting left, because it costs much, much, much less to fix something before it's detected than it does to detect it, go through a whole cycle, fix it, and then go through the cycle again. But I think we kind of all know that's kind of standard. The earlier you catch a problem, the less money it costs you story.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, by the way, that production cost for defects, I mean, that one needs to be a range with no end. I mean, because there are cases where a certain type of problem in production means complete exploit and loss of the company.
I used to
So
do
this one,
I used
yeah.
to do a lot of work for a major e-commerce flower delivery company, and they estimated that every 5 minutes they were down cost them at least 150 to $200,000 during certain times of the year,
Oh,
which is insane. So you're correct.
yeah.
um, I do think that prioritization has a very, very large role to play in remediation, because you have a lot of problems. You maybe don't have the time to fix all of them, even if you should. But
Hmm.
at minimum, you have to choose what you're going to fix first.
Yeah, you have to triage.
And one of the things, and this is a slight plug, we do have a product that's called Prioritize that helps you do this. But there are other methods as well as simply just looking as, are you actually using this library that happens to be have a vulnerability? Maybe you're not even using it. But fundamentally, whether or not a particular vulnerability can be reached from your code is a better signal of priority than
Yeah.
just having a vulnerability somewhere in your code base.
Correct, correct.
Um,
It's like So by the way, so people often liken vulnerabilities to like a grenade. Like a grenade gets tossed, into the developer room. I think it's a lot different. It's actually more like, and again, this might be a European thing. You see these news stories where there is like a World War II bomb discovered in someone's backyard. Like 2 meters down or a meter down or something. And so there's a very big difference between whether that bomb is alive or not. Like either way, probably take it out. But like if it's live, evacuate, take it out now, kind of thing. If
right.
it's like a completely, a dud, that changes it completely. And so when it comes to software, it's similar, right? There's been some lurking problem that's been discovered. And what we saw, as a company that services vulnerabilities, there's almost, you do see like a kind of like almost like a backlash where people say, they get alerts, and they say, oh, the alert came from white source, but then they'll be like, oh wait, this one's not like, well, I checked and actually we don't use that function or something like that. And like they don't necessarily blame, but like if you could find a way to automatically do that, send a machine instead of a human, then there's a great value in that, both in time saving as well as getting everybody on board. So signal versus noise. If you can send people only the vulnerabilities that actually are getting touched by your code rather than all of them, it's a big mindset difference.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned what we've seen. We did some numbers. What we've seen is basically 70% of the time that bomb isn't live.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm
that was
rounding, but
Yeah, that was massive. Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, that's huge. Like if you think if you are a company that does have like automated alerts, you would definitely be familiar with, somebody telling you, hey, drop everything, have a look at this. And your answer is, yeah, we're not even using that part of it, or that's impossible. Well, what we want to do is we want to automate that detection of impossible.
right. I mean, but still, you fundamentally do not want to have a bomb, even a dead one, buried underneath your lawn, right?
Right, right.
Something could happen. Um,
Yeah, yeah. So it's
who
good. I mean,
knows?
it's
You
still good to
could
get
call
rid of
that
them.
method tomorrow, right? So you do want to
Yes.
fix that.
It's good to get rid of them, but it's very, very good if you can prioritize which ones you get rid of.
Right. You just want to focus on the ones that actually matter first, matter
Yeah.
today. The ones that might matter tomorrow come second.
Yeah. There's a difference between drop everything versus like take it out in the next sprint, for example.
And there's also a difference between me going to the next slide and just slamming my hand on the keyboard. Sorry about that.
Go on.
There we go. So, look, we just want to kind of start closing off here with kind of a quick summary. We were just talking about remediation, but that's only one piece of that. Developers really do need robust tools that fit through the workflows and ecosystem at every phase. Yes, you want to shift left. Yes, developers are demanding and are increasingly being asked to take more responsibility for security, and they need tools, but it's not like you can just ignore the other pieces as well. You should be going through pre-build, build, post-build, scanning and testing. So it's very important to keep in mind that not just developers need tools, but other people do as well throughout this phase. Basically, every single part of your SDLC should have something to do with security.
Yeah. Actually, I know there's a good. I noticed a question being posed that I want to answer once we're done because it's related to what you just said.
Actually, I'm purposely rushing because we have so many good questions. I just want to make sure we have some time for it. But honestly, let's close this off and we'll go to questions.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay, so the one I saw I wanted to answer first, it said, because I've been asked this one before, and it's a really good question. Does shift left mindset, and just to recall, shift left for meaning kind of, shifting it more into the early stage of development, does shift left mindset still applicable to DevSecOps model with continuous security needs? So I'll rephrase it a little. I hope it's capturing the intent. We're becoming more and more with continuous delivery. So this concept of like really distinct phases of, build, test, deploy. The answer is actually yes. I mean, it's still very, very, very much. It's, because the more quickly you release, the more important it is to be aware of security in the development center. I mean, because you don't want to just be leaving people with like, half a day to assess the security implications. And essentially, it's still the same. Like the earlier you catch it, even if your build, test, deploy cycle is like shorter iterations and faster, it's still better if you can have the tools in the developer's hands to still not make the mistakes or catch them when they're building it. So yeah, definite yes here. And I'd even say that the more often you release, the more imperative it is to have kind of like really good and automated security tools.
Yeah, and it's funny, the same person who asked the question later on was saying like, I don't think the dev team is wired for a security mindset. You have to automate as much as possible. Yes.
Yeah. No,
Right.
we agree. I'm a bot author. I write automation. I love automation. I agree with you. I hope I've said never send a human to do a machine's job enough times that you believe me.
Right, and fundamentally that is part of shifting left, right?
Yeah.
It's giving those developers the tools they need, which includes advanced automation.
Yeah.
There are ways to do that automation that vary, but fundamentally you do want to give that development team some level of responsibility, even in a DevSecOps model. They're still in that model.
Yeah.
DevSecOps still has dev in it.
Even if you're just like teaching people to be better at circulating up security concerns or questions early on.
Right.
You're developing a new feature and like, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to like push data to S3 temporarily, and then we're going to put something in a queue. And then immediately, if you're in a DevSecOps kind of mindset, you should be thinking, well, okay, we need to think of all of the, possible exploits in that development. Like we're putting customer data onto, a read write kind of thing. We need to think about this. So, yeah.
And fundamentally, I do think there's I want to take a little issue. I'm going to call them out a little bit. Dev teams are not wired for security mindset. I'm going to state that as maybe we're not wired for a security mindset. Part of what we're seeing is people are becoming increasingly conscious of security, even on the left. Partly because they're being asked, partly because everybody's doing a better job of educating it. So those ops teams that have been trying to deal with security for a long time, or the security teams, realize that they can educate the developers and prevent some issues. It might be true to say they are not in general now wired for a security mindset, but I think that's changing, and eventually it will be that they have a security mindset in the development.
Yeah, yeah. There was another question on why the ops and infrastructure team is not emphasized or called out in our slides.
So I think that's an interesting one. I'm going to say that mostly it's because I think we would be preaching to the choir. What was the topic we were trying to talk about? How is this changing? I think the ops and infrastructure team, which has usually been involved with the security team, already kind of understand most of the security problems.
Yeah.
It's not as fun to talk about the people who already knew what they were doing that they still know what they're doing.
Yeah.
It's basically where I'm at.
I think we also like saying the word DevOps lots. So that's
I know. I just did a webinar on Monday actually called about DevSecOps specifically. And I also will say I don't think very many people are really embracing the whole DevSecOps yet. I do think most people are still in a DevOps frame where they're shifting towards DevSecOps. Very, very similar to how this was years ago when DevOps first started being a thing, right? Everybody started shifting slowly over. So,
yeah. Okay, I think that pretty much wraps up the questions.
Great. Yeah. I just have a question for you guys also. It's Christina again. So you mentioned tools. What type of tools, should the developers be asking their managers for to help them in the DevOps world?
I'll take that one. I'm going to suggest they look at white source very seriously and then tell their bosses they need to buy that. I might have a little bias in that.
Yeah.
But realistically, I mean, my joking aside, tools that they need are going to have to help them automate, give them the information early, help them with information on how to fix vulnerabilities once they're found. And the farther left in the mindset it is, the more it's going to help that developer. I mean, Reese, do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I'd say there needs to be like any tool that increases the transparency or visibility of security policies. It's not good enough to say developers are responsible, but then they don't have the ability to automate the checks during their part of the development lifecycle. Like it's not good enough just to leave it until a security review and they're like, well, look, we did a scan of this and we discovered that you've used some bad dependencies or something. That scan needs to be in the development process. So whatever are the policies that are applied in what would traditionally be the security view, as much as possible need to be pushed left and need to be, made available to the developers.
There's one other thing I'll add, which is any tool, period, that a developer asks for needs to integrate into their ecosystem and the tools they use, the languages they use, the package managers they use. It sounds obvious, but too often people forget to actually think about how does this work with my other tooling? So that would be one of the very first things.
True. Avoid context switching. If developers work in GitHub, bring the tools into GitHub. If they work in GitLab, bring them into GitLab. I won't list every platform. I'll save you from that. But that's the point. Like,
just go through the whole list.
Yeah. We got another 5 minutes. Let me list every platform I know. But basically, bring the tools where the developer lives. Don't expect them to be, like logging into other systems. Like I forget. I'm good. I don't reuse passwords. I'm bad. I forget them if I don't log in for a week. So don't, let them use the tools where it is they're normally working.
That's funny. Forgot password is basically my password nowadays. So.
That's a great point that you guys bring up. We just had another question come in asking if white source works with checkmark and other vendors.
Oh, that's actually kind of applicable to what we just talked about. Yeah. So we have synergies with a lot of vendors. Like I said, we're not going to list them out, but between technologies, platforms, and vendors, I mean, I think we have something like 200 plus different languages, technologies, or platforms supported. I don't remember every single one of them off the top of my head, but that's something we can also follow up with you directly if you put that in the chat.
Yeah, so similarly, so things like particularly the continuous integration and continuous deployment workflows, whether it is like, Circle CI and Jenkins, CloudBees and things like that, we also aim to kind of bring those tools into those workflows rather than trying to reinvent any wheel.
Yeah, at the end of the day, you got to reuse, right? As
Yeah.
anybody who's really using open source understands, I think.
I would say that like you don't want to have like double up duplication, but especially in the area of security, it can be good not to just rely on one single source of truth. I mean, you can have the source that you rely on the most, but it is good whether it is using like a combination of free tools and commercial tools, or potentially even a combination of vendors. And by the way, that's actually one reason why it's good to remove known vulnerabilities, even if you think they are, non-active or non-effective, because ideally you probably have some other tool somewhere also warning you about it that may not be quite as sophisticated, and it's better to just remove them at the earliest opportunity, rather than kind of having one tool tell you that you don't need to.
Yeah. All right.
Great.
I think
Well, yeah, thanks. That was a great presentation, guys. Is there any, final thoughts or key takeaways you wanted to add before we leave?
other than to say thank you to the audience and Reese.
Yeah, thanks for the questions, and thanks, Christina, and it was really enjoyable.
Great, thanks, guys. Again, that was Reese Arkins and Jeffrey Martin, Director of Product at WhiteSource, and I'd also like to thank WhiteSource for sponsoring today's event. Until next time, I'm Christina Cardoza with SC Times.